So the recording is started. I'm going to let people start joining us from different locations. We'll wait a few seconds to just make sure that we have our guest joining the session. So for those of you who join us in the meantime, this is going to be an open conversation. So we really want to also have our audience participate with their questions, with their comments to the group. We will give it a few more seconds just to make sure that we have more people joining us. We have guests from different places around the world. This is super exciting. I also want to mention that this session is recorded. If you know anyone that could not make it today, it's going to be available later on the California Israel Chamber of Commerce YouTube channel, and we invite people to join us afterwards and just listen to the comments that were told today. So, see, people are still slowly in our waiting room joining us. So give it a few more minutes. In the meantime, I want to thank you all for joining us today, wherever you are, for this open conversation. It's really exciting to have you here. If you can open your cameras and be part of this conversation, it will be fantastic. If you cannot, it's okay. We understand. No worries about it. I want to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Sharon Vanek. I'm with the California Israel Chamber of Commerce. For those of you who don't know us, we are a nonprofit organization based in California with operations also in Israel. And really our mission is to provide opportunities for different industry stakeholders to meet, to coordinate, to communicate, to get educated, and of course to have sessions like this for an open conversation between different either experts or experience, just a peer learning kind of a session. I'm very happy to have this session today about global employment. We have some speakers that are going to be our anchors for the conversation, and it's going to be moderated by my friend Boaz Maor. I also want to tell you before I'm going to introduce our speakers for today that this is going to be an open conversation. So please either raise your hand and ask a question or make a comment. You can always use the chat box also to put your questions there, and we will make sure that we are going to answer it. If you have a more specific question which is relevant to your company and you don't want to share it here out in the open, and again, since it's going to be recorded, you can always reach out to us and we can comment on that later on. You know what? I think it's going to be a good time to ask you if you want to stay in touch. You can use the chat box to actually put your name, your email, your contact information, and we can always do it, stay in touch afterwards. Again, our intention is to have it as an open conversation. Before we actually start, I want to say hi to Guy Barrell, who is on the line with us. And Guy was actually very generous. Guy Barrell is the co-founder and CEO of Candytech. Candytech is an Israeli startup, and he promised to every participant in this session to actually have 2 months free access to their platform. So I'd love to hear more about what Candytech is doing afterwards, for the sake of our guests that are going to get two months free access to your platform. So hold that thought. We'll hear from Guy later on about what Candytech is doing. With that, I'd like to start and introduce our moderator for this morning. Hi, Boaz Maor. Boaz? Oh, okay.
Good morning here, good morning in California, good morning, good evening in people in Israel and wherever. Thanks, Sharon, for coordinating this session. We have a panel of experts. We've done a couple of sessions to prep for this call and talk about the major trends and changes happening in the world of employment. A lot has happened in the world in general, COVID specifically, also in the US with the changes of administration. And those combined changes are making big impact on people trying to employ and manage a diverse workforce, especially as it travels between different countries and continents. So we'd like to have a little bit of a conversation. To make it most effective, the way we'd like to do it is I'll direct a few questions that we have solicited and worked on before to the different panelists. Each of them will introduce themselves as they start to talk, and you can see, if you're in the audience, you can see the very wide breadth of experiences that we have here that can be resources for you going forward in this session or afterwards. And then we'll open up for your questions should you have additional ones over time. So with that, I'd like to start with you, Lior. HR professions have played a critical role over the years in leading workforce transformation. As you think about 2022, what are the major trends that you see coming up? You're on mute. It's not a bug, it's a feature.
You're right, I am on mute. Thank you so much, Boaz. Well, first of all, a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Israel, and in the past 23 years, I live in the Netherlands. My background is actually IT, and in the past, a little bit more than a year, I work for Globalization Partners, which is a company who delivers employer of record and supports companies, mainly startups and scale-ups, who want to expand abroad. So thank you for the question. And some of the challenges that HR teams may face include, first of all, think about having a clear strategy in place in order to drive innovation of learning. Companies need to have a culture that encourages employees, and it doesn't matter in any level, to continuously keep and learning throughout their careers. They should also redesign the learning from face-to-face to remote and hybrid learning. As a result of that, another challenge that they're facing are the costs for the training and innovation per person. And access to global talent hubs is another challenge. So where do you find the right people? And we also noticed that employees' expectations have actually increased in the past year. And this is a serious challenge to meet. How do you keep your employees satisfied? Within Globalization Partners, we come on a daily basis across issues that we support that can be around compliance, payroll, salaries, tax, local regulations, and much more.
Yeah, it's definitely, COVID in specifically has driven a massive change in people's expectation, right? As we moved from work predominantly in the office to work predominantly at home. Statistics I've seen at the end of 2020 were that prior to COVID, about 4 to 5% of the US population worked from home 1 or 2 days or more on a weekly basis. During the peak of COVID, that number jumped to a little bit over 20%. Still, a lot of people in services, industries, manufacturing, etc., had to work in facilities, but over 5x jump from working in the office to working remote, and that makes a big change. Jason, when you think about those changes and how they impact what employees can do and what employees require and request companies to support, what are some of the changes we see in terms of benefits? Different changes to what people are allowing employees to expense or provide to employees differently?
Sure. What we've seen over the course of the pandemic is the change as you, sorry, I'm Jason Russell from Deloitte. My practice focuses in the area of compensation and benefits, specifically with a tax focus. Susie Horwood is a colleague with me on the call here today. We're part of the same practice area. I deal with payroll, employment tax, executives, and acquisitions. In this specific area, what we've seen is that what people did before the pandemic is they might be checking email from their kitchen table on a random Friday or Monday morning. During the pandemic, that became a 5 or 6 day a week practice, and their tolerance to sit with their laptop perched on a cardboard box, in their children's playroom, in a closet, on the bed, in a corner of a small home, The longer the pandemic stretched, that became not workable for ergonomic reasons, for productivity reasons. So companies have looked to find a way to recreate a work experience at home by providing the necessary tools and equipment. What we have seen companies do in large part is they have first provided technology allowances to allow employees to remain connected, both with increasing mobile phone device allowances and then providing for home internet Wi-Fi access. From there, we saw companies expand into providing additional equipment. So the types of equipment that you might have seen in the office, you now see at home, with standing desks and laptop stands and secondary monitors, sometimes ring lights or additional cameras. And then now that we're starting to see companies carefully explore either a hybrid work situation with part work, part in the office, or a return to office, we're seeing the resumption of some of the typical office fringe benefits like employer provided meals, which has always been a focus of whether those should be taxable as a personal living expense, and whether you can make an argument that while we're still in a pandemic, is there a health and safety reason that you could make to call those non-taxable? And when you talk about moving employees through space, where commuting is typically a personal expense, if you're providing employees either mass transit or additional parking, or even providing them a ride share or another private car, can you provide that on any kind of tax beneficial basis? So the short answer to the question that you asked is anything that can make employees' lives simpler and easier to get work done for your company, I would say is on the table. And we get asked as to, can I provide it? Must I provide it? And if I do provide it, can I do that in a tax efficient manner?
That's so interesting. We did, I manage a team of, a couple of hundred people right now, and we deal with that quite often. Susan, is there a difference in terms of the laws when you deal with very small teams to large? Is there any kind of a threshold? Hey, if I only have a couple of people, you can do this way, but if you have above X amount, I have to do something differently?
The threshold question, it's one we get asked often. Jason did a little bit of my introduction. I also work at Deloitte in the same team. My focus is on working with companies in HR and tax issues around all things mobility, which now more often than not encompasses remote and flexible work arrangements as well. And the threshold question, when do I need to get worried about doing this and following this tax rule to the letter of the law, is something that we get often. It's complex enough when you're just focused in the US and in one location, because the US has multiple states and each of those states have different rules around what that technical rule is. And then a lot of organizations will take that technical rule and layer on the administrative complexities of complying with that technical rule. So if the technical rule says you can have someone working in a state for 10 days before they get taxable, is that 10 days something that a company can administratively track, comply with, without putting too much burden on all of the organization systems that support that? Layer on the fact that you could be working in a different country and we've got a whole different network of rules and thresholds to apply. So the short answer is no, that there's no one threshold that applies. It's going to be based on facts and circumstances. And then where companies spend a lot of their time thinking through the impact of that is the administrative impact of where they want to set that threshold so that they can be compliant, or compliant as possible, within the realms of the operating systems that they have in place.
Got you. Thank you. I want to go back to the legality of things, maybe with Sahara, who's our resident lawyer on the call. But before we go there, you talked, Susan, you mentioned, different states have different rules. One of the things that we see, and is quite challenging, are people moving among states, right? They used to work in one place. They don't need to go to an office. They stay at home, might as well maybe stay somewhere else. Dustin, what do we need to pay attention to most carefully when we consider the fact that people are moving? Sometimes they tell us, sometimes they don't even tell us.
Yeah, well, hello, everyone. My name is Dustin Knievel, and I've got almost 30 years of experience in HR and recruiting. Probably over half of that has been in tech in some way, shape, or form via Seattle and San Francisco, working for international companies. I worked for GitHub and Equinix most recently, and right now I'm working for Planet Scale and building out their whole talent acquisition function, everything that we're doing there. So very excited to be here. And in answer to your question, what I've always heard and kind of relied on when people are relocating is, because we've had to deal with this a lot with Planet Scale and GitHub, because we have people who want to be digital nomads and they want to have that flexibility to go wherever they can go, work wherever they want to work. And I think kind of the general rule of thumb to follow is that if somebody is in some place for more than 90 days, then you start to kind of, raise an eyebrow as to what you're doing. I can go, I've got the flexibility. I can spend, I just spent 3 weeks in Massachusetts working remotely. That's not going to raise anyone's attention. But if I start to be there for, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, then you have that potential of where it could catch something, and especially when you're dealing with different countries. We have the difference, and this came up already here in the US, of you have different states that have different taxation, they have different labor laws, and things like that along the way. So if you have somebody who has moved to a state, they've set up a permanent residence there, then you need to set your business up to register, with that state and to be registered as a business in that state. You'll want to make sure, of course, that your HRIS or payroll system, we use ADP right now, so we've got both of them combined, can support that registration. Another thing to keep in mind with that is we were on a platform called Gusto, for example. They would do the registration for us. ADP, we have to do the registration on our own. So those are some of the things that you need to keep in mind. The other thing that I would say, especially this is a very US unique thing, and this has happened my entire career, is something that we've had to deal with, is you have a place like, say, New York City, Philadelphia, where you have your federal, your state, and your local taxes. And then you'll have someone who is actually living in New York or Philadelphia, but will give you an address, a mailing address outside of that area, so they can skip out on some of the taxation. So you want to make sure that you're aware of those and set up some policies around that, because those are the types of things that you are potentially putting you out there at risk.
Yeah, we are starting to challenge the boundaries between the HR function and the legal side of things. So Sahara, good segue to you. We mentioned a little bit differences between states. When we did the prep call, you suggested there is significance in the planning of what should we do in order to enable the kind of flexibility we might want with our workforce as we think about different places around the US. What is most advantageous to consider when people move, when we know that people are going to move more than they have used to move before among different states?
Thanks for the question, Boaz. Hi, everyone. I'm Sahara Pines, and I've been practicing employment law for over 20 years, both on both coasts in New York and California, currently based in Los Angeles. And I focus on preventative counseling, and I work a lot with startups to get their HR infrastructure in place, all of their documents and onboarding and the like. So before I answer that question, I just want to go back because Jason and Susie gave us some important information from a tax perspective, and also what they're seeing best practice wise in terms of what employees are asking to be reimbursed for. And I just wanted to point out that as it goes to different state laws here in the US, there are some states that actually require reimbursement for reasonable and necessary business expenses, which now the state of California has said includes home internet and cell phone. So Illinois is another state that does require that, and there may be others, but it may not be just a want or a great thing for employers to do. It may in fact be a legal mandate, which could cause class action lawsuits when you're talking about larger companies, of course. So another thing you want to think about when you're talking about employees in different states, or as Dustin mentioned, people who are working maybe remotely for 90 days, is that the sick leave laws kick in. And there are paid sick leave laws now in more than a dozen states and in more than a dozen different cities. So you have to actually know where the employee is physically located, because if they're physically located in a city, let's say San Francisco, they need to start accruing paid sick leave after 30 days. And every city and state obviously has its different wrinkles just to make globalization a nightmare for growing companies. But that's really something that we're seeing is challenging a lot of startups with a remote workforce in different states. From the advantageous standpoint, I mean, you want to be in a red state, right? You want to be in a state that doesn't have paid sick leave, that doesn't require paid time off or paid accrued vacation time to be paid out upon termination, because both of those things are significant cost measures. And just in general, there's fewer laws that you have to keep track of sort of in the South or the middle of our country.
Yeah, this is so interesting. Jason, separately from the legal side of things, right? Since people move a lot among states, is it common to change compensation?
I haven't seen a consensus with that yet. We were curious when the pandemic started. It doesn't necessarily impact the taxation because it's still wages. But as people have moved from higher cost jurisdictions to lower cost jurisdictions, those people that have moved away but still work for a company that's headquartered, say, somewhere in California, maybe somewhere in New York, they still would have occasions to report back to those headquarters locations for meetings. Where if you were a local employee, you could just show up to the office because that would be your normal workplace. Then if you've become remote, then the company needs to send you there on business travel, which is an additional expense. So one of the things that we did talk to companies is, by knowing that you're going to take on this additional business travel expense, does that mean that you're going to adjust compensation to account for your additional cash outlay? Because we're still in a pandemic, I would say from where we sit, we haven't seen a consensus come out yet from companies as to, yes, we're going to geolocate compensation. No, we aren't. Companies have been tiptoeing it carefully. And what I have observed in the marketplace from my client base so far is that is an issue for another day, while companies have tried to keep the wheels on the bus during these uncertain pandemic times. But from an ongoing recruiting perspective, it's going to become unusual the more successive classes that you have. If you have people that were hired with the expectation that they report to a high cost jurisdiction, but you could eventually be hired at the same rate of pay and be able to work in a lower cost jurisdiction. So it's definitely an interesting conundrum that, from my observation, admittedly as a tax advisor, I haven't yet seen a consistent response to.
Yeah, I know a couple of HR professions in large tech companies in California that have dealt with that, because specifically in California, it is a very high cost place of work. A lot of people who move into California, or used to be required to move into California, require the pay adjustment to take care of those incremental costs. And now in the pandemic, those companies have seen a lot of those people move out of California and have played, like you said, there's no consistency, but played with different kind of schemes. One of them in particular, a very large tech company here in the Bay Area, announced to their employees that anybody who moved to a state where the difference in cost of living is more than 10% will have to adjust, or the company will adjust their pay by up to that amount. But if you're under that amount, you can take advantage of that. But like you said, I've seen differences and no consistent structure right now, which is very, very interesting. Continuing the conversation.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in because you've got different minimum wage laws and requirements in different states too. So as you're adjusting comp for cost of living, you have to make sure that you're paying attention to the state again and city minimum wage laws. And when you have someone who's classified on a salary, who's classified as an exempt employee, every state has a different minimum wage threshold in order for that person to even be paid on salary. So here in California, the minimum wage threshold has gone up to 58,000. So nobody can earn less than 58,000 if they are, quote, an exempt employee. And that still shocks a lot of people because they're hiring assistants in the $40,000 to $50,000 range. And, that's sort of a per se unlawful classification right now.
Right.
I would also like to add another thing I think that's important to keep in mind in this line of conversation is that I've worked for companies that have done both, where they do the geographic differentials. I've even seen California, because of the complexity of California, split into 3 different regions, where the Northern California is more expensive than Southern California, and then the eastern half of California is a different range. So there's lots of different things you can do. Right now, the company that I'm with, Planet Scale, our strategy has just been to base everything off the Bay Area and pay it at that level. But I think the other thing that's emerging here in the US that's important to keep in mind is some of the local and state laws around pay transparency. For example, in Colorado, if you have an employee in Colorado and you have a job where somebody could be hired in Colorado, technically you're supposed to put the salary range and the bonus potential on the job post. May 15th of this year, that goes into in effect in New York City. There's a law around pay transparency, and it's also there's bills that are being considered in Massachusetts, New York State, and I think South Carolina is the other one. So I think that this is something we're going to see more and more of. I roll back like 5 years ago was when some of the first things laws were coming into place where you couldn't ask about salary history, and now it's kind of the norm that nobody's doing that. And I have a feeling this is probably going to be something that goes into the norm on this topic. So
yeah, I totally agree. As I think about, if you're a startup in Israel and you want to start operating in the US, right? The question I asked Sahara, you probably want to establish your base in a place where there are the least of those constraints. You can then decide what you want to do, compensation, transparency, how much you pay. But if you have less of those laws requiring you, you have a little bit more flexibility to decide, as opposed to be told by the government, quote unquote, right, what you can and cannot do. So that's interesting. I have so many other questions, but I do want to do a quick break, Guy, and enable you to introduce the company, Candytech, which is also a member of the CACC, and what you are providing companies.
Sure, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So hi everyone, I'm Guy, and I'm not coming from the HR field. Until 2 years ago, I was a general manager of a gaming studio here in Israel. And during my last few positions, I found myself dealing a lot with hiring people as a hiring manager, and it was a very big pain for me and for my managers. You can tell the pain. And to make a long story short, I founded Candytech 2 years ago with a vision of giving every candidate a fair chance to showcase their professional skills, regardless of resume and background, in a bias-free manner. And our way to do so is by creating SaaS platform that basically provide hiring managers and talent acquisition teams with the tools to mimic any position within the company, to create tailor-made job simulation tests for any position within the company, from R&D, BI and analytics, to marketing, sales, and everything between. The idea is to provide a very nice candidate experience. Candidates more feel like they get a chance to see how their future job is going to look like, rather than just having a test. And from the hiring manager perspective, a very valid tool, because work sample tests considered to be the best predictor for job suitability and the most objective tool. We work with many companies here in Israel, in the US, in Europe. Companies like Monday, Fiverr, IronSource, Moonactive, Payoneer, Nayax, Moveit, Optimove, Connecting, Forter, SimilarWeb, Outbrain, EY, and many others. We're getting very good feedback from them. And as mentioned, we're offering 2 months free trial. So if you're interested, please feel free to reach out, and I will be happy to explain in more detail. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Much appreciated. I've had a lot of discussions, interestingly, this week about, again, going back to laws / social responsibility and making sure that we don't have biases I guess we all have biases, but trying to make sure we minimize those, and some of those services might be very valuable. So love to have a conversation maybe later. Going back to compensation, which I think is an area of a lot of concern. Sahara, starting with you and maybe follow up from Susan. Companies that move people from Israel to the US as part of opening an office here or growing the workforce here, there's always the question of, okay, they used to be paid XYZ in Israel. How do I determine what's the right amount to pay them in the US? Can I continue to pay them the Israeli rate? Do I apply a certain percentage of that? What's the best way to get to the right number?
Yeah, a couple of considerations there, Boaz. First is that they do need to be paid in US dollars. And I just say that as a threshold issue because we've certainly had clients who want to pay in Thai baht or other foreign currencies. The next thing is, again, looking at the state in which they are physically located. So you could be a Delaware corporation and set up your entity in Delaware, but it really depends where that individual is going to be physically sitting as to what sort of the laws and the pay structure are around their employment. And as I mentioned, those minimum wage and the exemption thresholds, because everybody wants to not track hours and to not have lunch breaks. So everybody wants to put people on, a flat salary. Another thing would be that you have to have a legitimate business reason for the differentiation in pay. So you can't just say that because this person comes from Israel or another country, that they're going to get the lower salary, because that would be making an employment decision based on their national origin, ancestry, the like. And that is not permitted in every state. So if you're giving them like a housing package or you're giving them other benefits for their relocation, you can probably justify a lower salary because it's an all-in comp structure. But there, again, has to be like an articulated, legitimate business reason for that differential.
Got you. Susan, anything to add from your experience?
So where I come in is usually on we've settled how much we're going to pay this person to relocate them or to have them in the US temporarily, but what's their net pay? What is their sort of take-home cash spend after all of the taxes that kick in? And that gets complicated really quickly, especially if the employee stays attached in some way, shape, or form to their origin location, their home country, right, where they're moving from before they relocate to the US. Where companies spend a lot of time talking to us is thinking through the policies around whether the company is going to pick up any of the tax cost, especially as it relates to relocation benefits, be it airfares or temporary housing or housing for a year or some sort of stipend as a result of the relocation, whether the company will pick up any or all of that tax bill, what that means, and what that means for the employee and the company from a reporting and taxation perspective. And I will say it varies greatly depending on what the company wants the experience of their employee or the candidate to be.
So lots of flexibility there for companies to decide how they want to treat those specific employees that move. It's a big action, right? To move someone across, the ocean, new place, and the tax implication and monetary implications are quite significant. But if I understand it correctly, there is a fair amount of flexibility in how to deal with that, obviously within the laws, but a fair amount of flexibility.
That's a key point. Companies can set policies in place to address things like the experience of the employee, whether it's a high touch experience where the employee isn't burdened by the administration of it all, or if it's sort of here, I'll throw money at you, you go figure everything out experience. That's a policy decision, but you still need to operate within the rules of the laws that are in place. Tax, immigration, HR, employee, all of that, all of those regulatory requirements exist as well.
Yeah, of course. Dustin, from your experience, putting again the law aside, what are some of the best practices that companies like, the people who attend this webinar and are looking for ways to differentiate themselves compared to others? What are some of the things that can be done on the people side, compensation, benefit, etc., to differentiate?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot that can be done, and I think that it's it's kind of up to you and what you as an organization want to do, what you want to emphasize. Like it was just mentioned about a high touch people experience. We've tried to do that in our organization. I think that I think the transparency is super important with your employees, and also too as part of your building your brand and you're trying to attract talent to your organization, is being transparent about some of those things that differentiate you from everybody else. Like, why would somebody want to be here? What is the challenge? What are they going to learn? How could they possibly move their career? What are some of the ways that we can support, that we as an organization support our employees? And I've always found, over the years, one of the biggest things to keep in mind is, intent is almost always good in what we're setting up in terms of, say, benefits or a compensation practice or something like that. But also keeping in mind that you don't want to go too far, because it's really hard to take some of those things away at some point, and be realistic about what you're doing. And, maybe at some point, maybe you have a plan of, we're going to add X now, we'll add Y in a year, and then we'll add on Z, rather than coming out of the gate really strong. Because again, that's I've been in that situation where it's a really big morale destroyer, where you have to start picking things, that are viewed as benefits or taken for granted by your employees away. So so I would say just be realistic and be transparent about what you're doing. Like, again, I found that when you're in an organization, I think one of the things to keep in mind about your comp and benefits is, what is an actual strategy that you have in mind about that? Is our goal that we're going to pay market, we're going to have at market benefits? That's great. Are we going to pay above market and then have below market benefits? You've got to write that balance, and you've got to be honest with your people and your employees, potential hires, about that.
Yeah, one of the main differences I found, really big one in terms of benefits in Israel versus the US, is a car, right? Most employees in Israel get a car as part of the benefits, and it's extremely common at many levels, not just senior management, completely not common in the US. And for people who haven't thought about it, it's a big difference. It's a lot of money. Anybody else want to contribute? This is an area with a lot of, potential ideas and creativity. Any special, types of benefits or adjustment that you have seen that you think, oh, this is something interesting that is, very effective in hiring people or positioning companies to hire best people?
I don't know if that was directed at me or if I'll just go ahead and jump in.
Anybody?
But, I think also too, the thing to think about in this is, what are some of the maybe low cost things that you can do as an organization? My last two companies that I worked with, I was with an organization called Equinix before this. This was 2020. It was the heat of the pandemic. I think everybody was super stressed and there were so many unknowns. What they did every quarter was they just closed the company down for 2 days for mental health days. And that was for everyone around the world. They got those 2 days off. What we do here at my current job at Planet Scale, we observe the first Friday of every month off. And it's a company closure. So we get at least 1 3-day weekend every single month. So I think those are things that are that you can do that aren't going to be, a huge cost to you. But again, I think you also, and especially given where we're at right now, you also have to set that tone and make sure that your employees know that it is okay to take this day off. Like, we have a really good work-life balance where I'm at right now, and everybody knows, like, okay, this is the first Friday coming up this Friday. It's a no work day. So, make it mean something if you're going to do it.
I really like that idea.
Yeah.
Can I add 2 things that I've seen a lot when people are asking me about expectations and sort of what the marketplace is looking at right now? And I'm curious to hear what you all are hearing. But the paid parental leave benefits, since there are very few places that actually require it in the United States, whereas it's so much more common in Europe and throughout the world. I actually don't know what the laws are in Israel right now with paid parental leave, but it's just sort of becoming one of those things that employees are asking about and expecting, and also ensuring that men and women are getting equal parental baby bonding benefits as well, since there have been a couple lawsuits on that. And then the other is the unlimited or discretionary vacation that, sort of started in tech and has been seeping its way out. Again, it's not for an entire workforce because you can't have non-exempts who need to track their time on it, but it works really well for small startups where everybody is classified as exempt, or for just a managerial level. And of course, you don't have the tracking and the payout upon termination issue. So those are two things that I'm seeing candidates look for.
I think also to add on that too is talk to your employees, engage with them, what's important to your employees. You may have, if you have a workforce, let's say maybe mostly under like 30, 35, parental leave might not be a big deal to them. That might not be something important. If most of your employees are in the 35 to 50 range, parental leave may be really important to them. So, I would say survey your employees, have conversations with them about what is really meaningful, for them if you're looking at a couple of different options.
I'm really curious, since we have some HR professionals on the call, if they have any tips that worked for them in their companies, if anyone is willing to share what they are doing in their companies to, just offers a benefit during the pandemic. So if anyone is willing to share, that would be great.
Or also things that have initially looked good and backfire for some reason. Don't do this, it's problematic.
I wonder, Boaz, what are you guys doing in your company in Talek?
So Talek is part of US Bank, which is a very large, 70,000 people organization. So we are guarded by a lot of, very broad rules and regulations of what we can and cannot do. We don't have as much flexibility as I would have liked. So to be perfectly honest, we do a lot of things under the radar. We don't have a policy, but we tell people that when they need time off, they just let us know, and we just enable people to take way more time off than they would normally put on the books, because we know that the reality is that people work more hours, whether you acknowledge that or not. Again, non-exempt is a little bit different, but within a normal workforce, I just see when emails come in, people work more time, and because they have kids at home in irregular times because of school closures and whatever, or parents to take care of for whatever other reasons, flexible schedules is critical. So we do a lot of undocumented, I would say, benefits, things that are like, hey, just whatever you need. When you need to walk, you walk. When you need to take time off, you take time off.
Right. Lior, I wonder.
What I've seen in other companies that is, I thought was brilliant. I was trying to do it at my company, but didn't work, is care packages, right? So kind of similar to, I can't remember who was talking about it, yoga mats, right? Sent to people so we can schedule, sessions with people to do yogas, once a week or every other week or whatever, as a mechanism to relax and just elevate to the mindset, right? The fact that we need that kind of time away from the actual work. So it's significance around that, care packages around holidays, things like that. In lieu of a party in the office or a happy hour in the office with, food and stuff, send it as small packages to people's homes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Lior, what's the practice in the Netherlands for that? We talk about the US, and since this is about global employment, can you share what?
Yes. You actually touched a very sensitive point. In the Netherlands, having a burnout is something that we see in a very, very large percentage. Luckily, it's a country which still works under social regulations, which means that if you are ill and you are declared by your doctor as somebody who had a burnout, you are entitled up to 2 years. You get a full salary. And companies have actually, and mainly HR people, have come to find workarounds how to tackle this problem, because obviously you don't want your employee to leave the company for 2 years. This is not really desirable. So in Globalization Partners, for example, we started a month ago. Everybody got registration for Calm, the app, to meditate, and we have once a week. We have mindfulness, half an hour, cross globe. Yeah, mainly it's the US and EMEA team. This is something really important that you touched.
Jason, I noted a few other people talked about more time off and different ways of time off. When it comes to companies' interactions with government agencies, right? The phrase "not all jurisdictions are created equal" comes to mind. And when you and I talked, you noted that there is a formal side to it and there's a pragmatic side to it. How should companies, right, as they think about working in the US, think about that side of interaction with the government on benefits?
Sure. Remember, in the US, there are both federal laws and then state laws. And then in some cities, there is a city level of taxation. So unlike dealing with most countries in Europe or around the world, there are actually, 40 or 50 tax regimes you have to deal with at the same time, depending where in the US your employees are. Before the pandemic, these rules existed, and the general rule that's out there in most of those jurisdictions for the US are where an employee's feet are on the ground working, a company is responsible for withholding the relevant taxes and reporting that accordingly. Those rules are not new. They didn't go in during the pandemic. They've been around for decades. Companies have taken a skeptical eye at most of them. Now, companies do pay attention to the ones in New York because New York tends to audit those very robustly. But other than New York, prior to the pandemic, it was mostly a traveling workforce, the business travelers, that would trigger a lot of, let's say, multi-jurisdictional withholding compliance. And that's a pretty small population at most companies. And so it wasn't a number that scared a lot of companies. I think you started this session by talking about the idea that employees that were remote or not working in a company's principal location or where the company thought that they were, from the pandemic has gone something like 3 to 5% to 20, and then from our observation can be higher. In some companies, it's 40 to 60% of their total workforce. So when you think about what kind of a financial risk that the company is taking on by ignoring where an employee's feet are on the ground working, it becomes a monumentally larger number these days where employees are not reporting to a company work location. So knowing that certainly in the US, there's multiple tax jurisdictions that need to be considered, what are companies doing right now? They're still not doing a lot, but they're admitting that they should be doing something. And they're focusing primarily on the jurisdictions that have been problematic from an audit perspective historically, which is principally New York at the state level. California is always one to be reckoned with as an audit body, but they're not yet organized to cover this issue, but will be, and will be less nice about it than New York has historically been. Just prior to the pandemic, Illinois started caring about non-resident withholding, which would cover this issue as well. Then the pandemic happened. Nobody really went anywhere for business travel. The idea of evacuating to Illinois from a different place, with their extreme summer and winter, they're maybe not going to be the most obvious destination, but they're a third jurisdiction that you would keep in mind. And then everybody else prior to the pandemic was not a heavy audit jurisdiction. During the pandemic is probably not going to step it up. Post-pandemic, it's too early to tell. But what companies are doing is trying to figure out, where are we going to tell our employees they can and cannot be, and how are we going to monitor that compliance? Because for companies of size, their presence is already everywhere, so adding a jurisdiction is not really the issue. It's the rest of it. It's monitoring your employees, because you can monitor your employees through your company provided technology. You can monitor them through the VPN on your company provided computers. The question that companies have wrestled with more from a people side is, do we want to? And what companies have found out during the pandemic is employees are not necessarily truthful, and relying on an employee attestation for some of this, because we're not dealing with business travel, we're not dealing with expense reports that are coming through an accounts payable channel, we have to rely on different data to get this correct. So it's bringing different conversations in to figure out how we can meet the company obligation with a vacuum of robust data to do so. So these are real-time conversations. And when Susie and I have them, we get companies that feel panicked for a pandemic that's been going on since 2020 about, are we late? No, you're very much on time. But the idea that you can wait longer and longer and longer, that starts to be somewhat of a stale concept. And so we've suggested that first you need to know where your employees are, certainly in the US and then also without the US, and then figure out how compliant do you want to be. But doing nothing and reporting them only to their prior to pandemic work location is starting to look a little more awkward because employees are also getting savvy to their own tax consequences and starting to ask questions of, well, shouldn't my wage reporting be different?
There is a question in the chat from MyBard. Sorry.
Sharon, I was just going to say, could I just add on to Jason's points, which were all amazing, that we've seen people who have been working in a different city and haven't reported it to the companies until they like want to go out on state disability or a state that has state paid family leave, and they then want to tap into a very generous state like New York's benefits. And you haven't been taking the taxes out, so they haven't been paying into that benefit, but they said, oh, well, we've been there for a year, we should be getting paid family leave paid by the state of New York. And that's a real mess.
So how do you deal with it? Like if you're a company, right, how do you get ahead of it? Can you do communication with specific guidelines to employees? Is it too much invasion of privacy? Like,
yeah, I mean, I think it depends how big you are and how, and how, again, how much you want to track, right? Like, and we'll talk about probably vaccinations, maybe if we have time. I guess we're running out of time, but that's another issue. Like, do you want to track? Do you not want to track? And there's pros and cons to both. At this point in the pandemic, I would say, like Jason, like you need to start getting information about where people are, whether it's a self-attestation or whether you're using a VPN to monitor where they are. Of course, if you have a smaller workforce, it's a lot easier to sort of know where people are and to manage it and make sure you're registered, as Dustin said earlier, and you're paying the appropriate taxes. Otherwise, it's going to come back not only to the employee, but to the company.
I can tell you that yesterday I received a note from my husband's work, and they said it's, voluntarily, if you want to report if you are vaccinated, your family members are vaccinated, everybody is sick, you don't have to, but if you want, it will help them manage because they work in what they call capsules. So, each day other people are coming to the office, but it's not just about the employees. What was surprising, it's about the family, that they want to know what's the family status. And of course the schools, at least with both my kids' schools, now they require that the kids will be vaccinated for the next school year. So that affects also the families and, the employees.
So we spend a lot of time, we're kind of running against the clock, aren't we all the time? We spend a lot of time talking about, different facets of, the people management function, a lot about regulations and laws and requirements, a little bit about the upside, the potential of what we may want to do to differentiate ourselves or help our companies. Any best practice suggestion that people have done to further motivate people, further help them throughout this, crazy times and changes? I'd love if we can share a little bit of those experiences around. Anybody from, the attendees on the call that want to share? Not all at once.
Yeah, very quiet. Well, there was a nice question also. I think Sharon started.
Yeah,
right?
there is a question in the chat box from MyBar. Maybe you want to MyBar, just ask it. You can unmute yourself and ask it.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. Can you hear me, guys?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So really, I'm just interested to understand if you feel like, just giving your employees the day off would really keep them motivated and happy, or do you also offer some, fun, exciting, engaging experiences to your employees, whether they are, you know, online or in person, or it's actually a little bit of both?
I'd be happy to jump in on this one. We've been doing some of the things that we've done as an organization. So we've had an explosive amount of growth in terms of more than doubling in size in just a little bit over a year. And we have employees in 26 states in the US and 16 countries total. So for us, it's a big deal on how do we facilitate employee engagement, provide a positive experience for our employees. And we've done a variety of things, like we have, I noticed in EMEA, they have a coffee hour for all employees. It's just kind of an open invitation that I think meets daily. We do, every time we have a new hire class, we do a kind of an all company, again, it's an open invitation where you can come in. We try to have some fun activities, introduce the new employees to the company. And in lieu of actually being able to get together in person, we've tried to do some of these other things, you know, to help build the connections. So yeah, I don't know that it's just necessarily extra days off, but I think there's other things that, you know, where the onus is really on the company on how can we, you know, provide those connection points for our employees when still so many of us are working remotely and so many of us are working from home. We're actually going to proceed in a couple of months. We wanted to do an all company meeting last summer, and for a lot of reasons, none of our employees outside the US could come at that point in time. So we're going to try to do one here in a couple of months. So hopefully, you know, again, you know, thinking of the things that make sense. Obviously, it's, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty in general right now, but I think there's little things, again, that you can do that help promote that.
In the chat section, Jason raised a really interesting point we are dealing a lot with, which is now that almost 2 years people worked from home, how do you get them back to the office? Many of them don't want to, right? Afraid of, or, you know, for many of them, there are incremental expense, right? You all of a sudden need childcare or, you know, commute, etc. So we're doing a lot of work on trying to promote the work back to the office. All kind of incentives, right? Happy hours, free lunches, whatever. But one other thing that a big picture we were thinking about and started to do where I work, and you may want to think of as well, is it seems like as you think about 6-12 months from now, kind of hopefully slightly post-pandemic type work, the work will have to change. The statistics out there from any survey indicate that people are extremely unwilling to go back to work, back to office 100%, and are requesting / demanding at least a hybrid environment, right? Some work from home, some work from the office. And that indicates that the work in the office will need to change, and therefore the layout of offices may need to change. It's going to be less relevant to have individual workspaces and more relevant to have larger meeting rooms, because people will come to the office to do the kind of activities where it makes sense to be with other people. My own personal work, well, I've done this for 2 years from home, might as well continue to do from home, but it's the meeting with others, it's innovation, it's whiteboard sessions, it's company meetings, all of the things that you need, larger office spaces, you know, conference rooms, etc. And therefore layout of offices might need to change. So again, if you think about, you know, the time ahead, that's an area that's worth consideration for each of your companies.
Thank you, Boaz, for that. You know, being sensitive of the time. First of all, I want to mention, if any of you would like to stay in touch with one another, please leave your name, your contact information in the chat box. I know Guy already did it. Thank you, Guy, for that. But anyone else, if you want to stay in touch, please leave it there. So as long as we have time, people can see it and reach out to you afterwards. The same goes with our speakers. If any of our attendees now in this session or later on, if you watch this video, if you have questions to any of our speakers, please reach out. We will be happy to, you know, make an introduction. You can ask them personal questions or questions that are more relevant to your workplace. I also want to mention that here in the Bay Area, we are going to host early March networking event for our HR community. If you are in the Bay Area and you are an HR professional, please follow us to, you know, find the advertisement for our next HR professionals networking session, where you can come and learn from your peers. You can get some ideas. get the social aspects, the in-person social aspect of meeting with your peers. Last questions from anyone from our listeners or from our speakers? Any last comments? Okay, so we'll just go around the room.
I have
yes.
one quick comment.
Sure.
This was kind of piggybacking on what was said just a few minutes ago. I think that one of the really important things to consider right now, especially back to work, things like that, is, I can't emphasize this enough, is engaging with your employees and what's important to them. There's so much opportunity right now. There's so many people, like, if you push too much, they'll find what they need someplace else. And so that's where I say, you got to keep that dialogue going and keep that transparency going, and don't risk losing really valued people over a decision that may not be.
Great. Thanks for that, Dustin. Lior, any last comments?
Just one thing.
Oh.
Sorry. Thank you, Dustin. No, just one thing, maybe as a tip, also pay attention for technology. This is something that we didn't brush. Also something important to take in account. There's many tools. Those are the things that can help going out of the pandemic. People has shown, many researchers has shown also that employees prefer to go working more remote. So the hybrid model, this requires also adjusting the technology. So this is something to take in account. Thanks,
Lior. Jason, any last comments from the tax perspective?
Our comments from the tax perspective are to make 2022 a year that a company takes action to understand where the employees are and to make withholding adjustments accordingly. Sleeping dogs can lie where they are for prior years, but 2022 needs to be a year of some type of action.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. And Sahara, last words from the legal perspective. And we didn't even mention that Sahara is hosting a podcast on employment. If any of you want to listen, Sahara.
It's called Legally Empowered, HERED, for female entrepreneurs. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts, but different episodes on different legal issues. My advice is going to be totally non-legal, which is just like be kind and be forgiving, because everybody is just so stressed and going through so much, and we all have to be good to each other.
Thank you, Sahara, for that, and thank you, Boaz, for the heart. Thank you, Boaz Maor, for being our moderator for today, and also sharing a lot of your experience as someone who's managing a couple of hundreds of people. I bet it's not just for the HR professionals, it's also for the managers, day in and day out, that need to manage and handle employees. Thank you all for being with us today. Again, this session was recorded. It's going to be available on the CICC YouTube channel. If you have any questions for us, please let us know. Thank you also, Guy Barrel and Candytech, for offering 2 months of free use of their platform, just to try and see if you like it. Guy's information is in the chat box, and we'll send you also an email afterwards if you want to take advantage of that. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Stay safe. Bye.
Bye-bye.